Hi, welcome to the Pharmacy Operators Podcast. Today we have on Jessica. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I'm really excited for this episode. Jessica comes to us from AcariaHealth. And for specialty pharmacy, there's often this kind of epic battle between the massive integrated players and the hyper niche specialty providers. But there's an interesting middle space, which is where you guys live. An organization with a lot of scale, but still small enough to be nimble. And so, what we'll be exploring with Jessica today is how her unique background has kind of influence different aspects of what they do. So she's come from the payer landscape as well as the specialty pharmacy side of things and how that influences Acaria today. So welcome to the show. Great to have you. We're going to hop into some questions. So you spent time in multiple facets of healthcare in addition to specialty pharmacy. How did that shape your understanding of value creation in healthcare? And what has sitting across multiple seats taught you about alignment and trade-offs?
Yeah, so I think we'd all agree healthcare is inherently a complex space, right? And when you think about specialty pharmacy in particular, because of all the stakeholders in healthcare and especially pharmacy, excuse me, it's very complicated because each piece is, each player is solving for a different piece, right, of the same patient journey. So having spent time in both payer and specialty pharmacy, I think has given me an appreciation for how value is defined differently depending on where you sit. So across the healthcare ecosystem, the overall arching priorities tend to align, right? Patient care, service, affordability, but the order in which they're prioritized and maybe the constraints around them differ depending on the player. And I think that really highlights a consistent theme. So the best outcomes really don't come from optimizing one part of the healthcare system. It really comes from reducing the friction and barriers between the parts. So in specialty pharmacy, value creation really lives in that middle space and comprehensively looks at access, affordability, and adherence. And the real opportunity we have, I think, is to help the system work better together so patients don't feel that complexity that we as an industry have really built around them. So you mentioned, AcariaHealth sort of sits in a unique intersection. I do. I think we sit in a place between scale and flexibility, given our size, that allows us to be thoughtful and fast and aligned with priorities within the healthcare ecosystem. But also enables that nimbleness, as you mentioned, right? We can do different customization. We can support care models that might be different without losing the quality that we're delivering. We always lead with a patient first mindset as an operating principle, not just a tagline that really shows up in the care models that we design for our patients. And I also think one of the unique things is our partnership with a broad range of payers really gives us a deep understanding about benefit designs and access solutions, which allows us to proactively guide patients and providers rather than reacting to the barriers that come down the pipe. So that really results in, an experience is a little more coordinated, less transactional for patients who are already navigating through the complexity. So, in summary, I think the priorities are aligned at the macro level in healthcare. And I've seen how important it is to ensure that you're reducing that friction or any friction between the various parts and ensure that, trade-off is not happening with patient care and outcomes.
Yeah. Is there an example of where you think you could highlight how, experience with the payer side of things or understanding of what they're doing has allowed your organization to get better at coordination or long-term management for the patient?
I think it all boils down to, when you think about what the objectives are, right? So from a payer perspective, they're thinking about, the overall arching ability to not just get one patient medication, right, and access. They're really thinking about how do we provide that broad access and, to medications longitudinally over time, right? Not just a one-time thing. And so I think that, they're just thinking about it a little bit differently. So the more value that all us as a specialty pharmacy can really provide to the payers to show the value of that and make that allow that to manifest as easily as possible, I think drives the most value.
Hmm. So you talked a little bit about how helping reduce the complexity the patient sees can really help improve that overall experience. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe something you've seen of what that looks like in practice?
I mean, there's so many ways in which that manifests. I think when you think about the different portions, like you think about the clinical complexities, right? You think about the needs that prescribers have to provide for patients to get access, the documentation, walking through prior authorizations. How can we help to navigate through that complexity to make that process as seamless and as quick as possible? Financial barriers, right, for patients as well, and helping patients navigate through what can be very burdensome cost for them to have therapies that really are dependent on from a life perspective. So, I think thinking about all of those aspects is important, and how they all work together and the ability to reduce those barriers in each of those buckets for patients and comprehensively making the process as seamless and as less complex as possible.
Yeah, that actually leads really well to the next question. So, do you feel like the bottleneck is, you know, clinical, financial, operational, or informational? And how do you prioritize solving for each?
Yeah, so I think I'll start when you talk about bottlenecks. I think, the good news is that the development work that pharma manufacturers are doing in the pipeline of therapies that we have has reduced the bottleneck around whether therapies exist, right? So that's a real
Yeah.
positive. Today, I think it's really about how quickly, affordably, and smoothly patients can get access to those available therapies. And in my mind, I think clinical and financial barriers probably remain the most significant and relevant today. So clinically, as I alluded to, prior authorizations, but delays often stem from misalignment or miscommunication, right, between prescribing intent, benefit requirements, or any documentation needs that plans may have. And patients and providers need, help navigating through the complex aspect of those. And utilization criteria is evolving and becoming even more complex as more and more therapies come to market. But AcariaHealth, have provider experience managers, right, that work directly with prescribers and office staff to help clarify some of those expectations, streamline documentation, and reduce that back and forth that removes some of the friction that you could say, I guess, also is / informational bucket, right? As you talk about clinical / informational. But at the same time, our clinical teams are engaging patients to get that personalized education, adherence coaching, disease support to ensure that patients get the right therapy at the right time with as little friction as possible. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the financial bottlenecks. So as you're aware, I'm sure the audience is aware, especially medications can cost tens of hundreds or hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And oftentimes patient cost sharing can be significant. So while there are assistance programs that do exist, navigating them can be kind of overwhelming. And you overlay that on an already sort of stressful and complex situation, it's tough for patients to navigate. So we leverage technology and support teams to really identify what those available assistance options are, from copay funding support, free drug programs, foundational support, and actively assist patients through that process. So care decisions are driven by clinical need, not financial. So two barriers, right, that I think we're helping to navigate through that probably float to the top. But on the financial side, we really see firsthand how removing those financial barriers really directly improves adherence and continuity of care. So it is a priority for us, and patients really do need that guidance and advocacy and a partner who understands both the clinical and financial journey through which they're navigating. And AcariaHealth, compassionate care means combining, the human interaction with technology and resources to really simplify that complexity on both fronts, to prevent those clinical and financial bottlenecks that can impact the speed to care.
What's interesting about what you said is you guys have provider experience managers. That's kind of a unique thing to you. Are these different from your sales team members? And what is the origin story of this type of role in the organization?
Yeah, so it is different from our field sales. So differentiating field sales from, sort of business development sales, but our field sales force is in the field working with prescribers, but our PIMs, we call them PIMs, they are working directly hand in hand with the office providers, really to support the patients within that prescriber's office. We really identified that there was a gap that we felt that we could, fill, and that is, really hand holding those offices and helping them navigate through. You think about the number of plans an office might have
Yep.
patients in, the number of different PA criteria, the number of pharmacies they may be working with. So anything that you can do to help alleviate some of that administrative burden for prescribers, again, gets at the heart of getting that patient the therapy that they need as quickly as possible.
That's really interesting. And kind of related to this is culture. I think you guys have a way of doing things in the way that you hire, in the way that you organize yourselves around product, around services that you offer. Whenever I've had a chance to interact with the team, there's a clear energy, a candor, a forward-thinking spirit there. It's clearly a very strong culture. How would you describe it yourself in your own words?
Yeah, so first, thank you for that. It means a lot to hear you say that. Culture is something that we're very intentional about and something the leadership team spends a lot of time on. I have always believed that culture really shows up, in how people make decisions when things are hard or they're moving fast. And at AcariaHealth, I've mentioned, everything really anchors around the patient and what we call the heart of Acaria. So it starts with the H of heart, and that stands for help. And that's help patients, providers, and each other with real empathy, right? So not just saying patient first, but slowing down enough to understand what someone is going through when you're talking to them on the phone. We empower our teams to really make those patient-centered decisions that allows us to amplify our impact, right, to our patients. And we give our team members room to grow, ask questions, bring ideas forward, and advocate for our patients internally, which is really foundational and allows us to continue to build on, build our culture internally. And we're very big on recognizing each other. We call out those moments where someone really lives the mission, because that's what reinforces the culture on a day-to-day basis. And underneath it all, right, the T of heart is trust in each other, transparency in how we communicate, being honest about what's working and not. AcariaHealth's mission is transforming lives with compassionate care, which is really well aligned with the heart of Acaria. We don't separate culture from strategy. Culture is really how strategy gets executed. And in specialty pharmacy, the product matters, right? As you know, the process matters. But what really makes the difference is how the team shows up in those critical moments when a patient is waiting, when they're confused, when they're overwhelmed. And so when the culture is strong, which I think it is at AcariaHealth, decisions get made faster. They get made with more confidence and always have the patient in mind. And when that happens, performance follows.
Kind of a follow on to that. So, as you know, in specialty, exceptions are kind of a rule. Even when there's good process and systems in place, there's things that can happen that make a patient go here or there where you didn't expect them to go. How do you balance delivering patient centered experiences at scale without going underwater or burning your team out? And I'm sure as a leader, you think about this probably a lot to understand, like, okay, what can we do to, support the team as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that engagement and that solid cultural foundation, it may be cliche, but I do think that that matters, and getting everyone anchored on the patient. You can't just translate that to, doing things that are not scalable, but having the mechanism, the transparency, and the trust to have those communications to identify where you do have breakdowns, and then everyone sort of rallying around and working together to figure out the best way to navigate through those, I think is important. So having that empowerment of team members to be able to do that, we're not always going to get it right, right? And there are going to be mistakes, but I think it's really important to ensure that people have the flexibility and the aptitude to try different things, to make those mistakes, but learn from those mistakes, right? So you constantly have to think about how you improve, but not be afraid to fail and pivot and try something else.
So hiring is often reactive, filling gaps or backfilling responsibilities. I've met a couple of your team members that were hired to be a little more forward thinking about like, here's where we want to build a strategic capability. How do you work backwards from strategic objectives to the role, skills, and organizational design you want in order to put those in place?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first we start with where we're going, and what we need to get there, not necessarily job titles specifically, but really reflecting on what skill sets we have that support that vision, what we don't have, and how those needs are going to evolve as we evaluate, those frictions that we've talked about that we're going to be solving for patients, providers, and partners 2, 3, 5 years from now. That's really what drove our shift toward a more product centric mindset and structure. So building the teams around the outcome, not just the function. We're very intentional about hiring people who can operate across that, complexity and change management, and not just execute, a specific narrow task. We talked about culture. For us, cultural fit isn't a nice to have when we're hiring. It's really a need to have. And we actively search for really patient focused thinking, curiosity, courage to change and be different and lead. Our leadership team is involved in the strategic planning. Everyone understands what we're building and why before we're adding headcount, and that carries directly into the hiring decisions.
What's an example of the last leadership hire that you made that was an outcome of was an outcome of like, we're trying to solve for this. This is what we need to bring on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the product centric mindset that I spoke to before, I mean, we hired a newly created position, which was VP product management and clinical strategy. So I think identifying that we were missing that hub, right? As you think about, the why and anchoring on the why, having that hub of product was an important aspect that was not present in our leadership structure. And so making that hire allowed us to really go through and navigate as a patient-centric organization and get on that journey.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you guys add on capabilities, add on different services with new team members, new initiatives, how do you think about change management and skill set alignment?
Yeah, so obviously change management is not specific to specialty pharmacy or to healthcare for that matter, and it is critical for all of us, and something I try to pressure test with the team quite a bit. In healthcare and specialty pharmacy, again, not unique, right? But change isn't, occasional. It's the constant, right? As the old adage goes. But because we're nimble, we expect that people are able to adapt, evolve, and innovate quickly. But we also support that with really clear communication, transparency, and maybe most importantly, right, that shared context. When people understand the why, I think change feels less disruptive and more empowering. And so I think, from my perspective, that's the crux of really how we're navigating through change management, is ensuring we have that communication, transparency, and shared.
Yeah, whenever a change is happening, when things are falling sideways, how do you differentiate between talent, process, alignment, and, how do you troubleshoot what's going on?
I'm not sure it's independent. They're independent of each other in full transparency. I think it's probably mostly, a combination of all of those things: talent, process, and alignment. I tend to trust my gut, but I also try to be really honest and direct about expectations and lean and trust on my leadership team. But, focusing on culture, kind of getting back to that when hiring and evaluating talent alongside that strategic planning process, I think addresses the talent and process aspect pretty readily. And we actively solicit feedback from the team. Team members are closest to the challenges that we have and great insight into what we may be missing, from a leadership team perspective. But I think reiterate the importance from my prior question, the criticality of communicating the why, which I think ties into that alignment, right? So I think all three of those things work together, and I think they have to work together.
Yeah, makes sense. So switching a little bit into innovation, innovation and strategy is in specialty can look different, organization to organization. How this ties to outcome, risk, margin, all needs to be managed pretty closely so that you can, actually function as a business and deliver great patient experiences. What are some ways you've thought about this particular balance? And how are some of the ways you've moved that are a little bit different than others in the space?
Yeah, so we've mentioned it. I've mentioned it before. At AcariaHealth, we really anchor everything around the patient, right? So innovation only matters if it's improving the patient outcomes or experience and helps to remove some of that friction that we talked about, right? That's across the system. So we're very focused on value innovation, what value and innovation delivers, not just innovation on its own. And I think inherent in that approach, right, is that risk benefit, assessment that everyone is balancing today. But we empower our teams to really evolve workflows, for instance, right, that drive and improve efficiency and the patient experience at the same time. We've got a program called Boost, which is an internal group of peers that allows team members to self-identify and share process improvements or port best practices from one area to another. I think that's a great example of our homegrown sort of innovation that drives that real-time value, and I do think is an aspect that helps differentiate us. We've really focused on the patient journey and simplifying that experience through digital tools and communication, et cetera, while increasing outcomes. I think all of those things together really differentiate the way that we think about innovation.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Boost program? How is it structured? What's the cadence? And when did you recognize there was a need or a want for this sort of program?
Yeah, so it was last year, early last year, I think, that we started it. And it really first kind of bubbled up as we recognized that there was a gap from a sales perspective and an ops perspective, right? There was opportunity, sales, there always should be healthy tension there, right? So I think that's a good thing. But having sales thinking about things from one perspective and ops thinking about it from another, not kind of talking past each other relative to what the goals and objectives are. So we created a forum for them to bring examples and kind of talk through like, hey, we thought this was going to go this way, and have that conversation and dialogue to create better transparency between the two organizations. And really how it evolved was, how can we troubleshoot together and work together to create a 1+1=3 type of scenario. And so it's evolved beyond just those two teams now. It's a cross-functional team that gets together and identifies these things. And the team can bring forward, anyone can raise their hand and say, hey, I've got an idea, or I've noticed X. And it can be as simple as, hey, on this screen in our adjudication system, the call to action is to call a patient, but the phone number is not on this screen, right? That's a very simple example of an improvement, but one that can make a big difference in the experience of the person that's on the phone and just help us add that incremental speed to therapy. So it's actually been a really interesting dynamic in creating more partnership, communication, and transparency relative to what everyone's doing within the organization and how to have that dialogue and create those opportunities for innovation and change.
That's really cool. That's a great way to build that sort of, at scale, it's hard, right? You have all these teams that they need to communicate, they need to collaborate, but here you've created something where they have that forum that allows them to do so in a way that's specific, but also broadly applicable. That's really
Right.
cool.
Right.
So as a mid-sized specialty pharmacy, you have not reduced to like niche specialization, which is what we see a lot of them do, focus on rheumatology or some other therapy or disease states. Why or what drove that strategic decision?
Yeah, so we've intentionally built a full service specialty pharmacy that brings really focused clinical expertise together with breadth of drug access, right? So not that specific disease state specialization or therapy class specialization, as you mentioned. So this really drives simplified care for the patient and allows us to add the broadest value to our payer clients. So we're small enough to be nimble and personable, big enough to have that scale and reliability and clinical depth, for our customers and our patients, and focused enough to be sort of responsive. I think pharmacists benefit from having that broad cross therapeutic training, but they also develop those disease specific specialization where it enhances patient care. And I think it creates a balanced model that allows us to, maintain consistency from an operations perspective, clinical expertise to drive the diversity of patients that we're treating, and really meaningful patient connection without sacrificing the flexibility and nimbleness that we have given our size.
Do you think this means that you're better able to serve certain patient populations than, say, like a specialty pharmacy devoted to oncology or rheumatology?
I don't know, better able. I think it helps us drive broader value to payers, right? Given the breadth of therapies and disease classes that we service.
Mm-hmm. So at a population scale, it makes a lot of sense to, yeah. If you had to bet on one shift that will define specialty pharmacy over the next 5 to 10 years, what is it?
If I had to bet on, something that I think is going to further define specialty pharmacy, I think it'd be greater integration across that full patient healthcare journey. So, we talked about the multiple aspects of healthcare. Specialty pharmacy won't be successful in just the specialty pharmacy silo. Clinical care, we've talked about clinical barriers, financial barriers, affordability, access, outcomes, and data all have to work together across the ecosystem. So organizations that win are going to be those that are able to connect those pieces seamlessly and still make the experience really center on the patient, not only with efficiency, but with compassion.
How do you think the provider relationship fits into the integration of information across the patient journey?
Critical. It's a critical piece. And I think it's not just pulling information from the provider. I think it's bi-directional communication. And I think that's a key aspect that needs to continue to evolve.
So you invest heavily in talent, creativity, team culture. How have your personal habits, jewelry making, pottery, welding, influenced your leadership, if at all?
Oh, so I have a diverse hobby list. I think, creativity for me has taught me to value progress over perfection. So when you're making something with your hands, you learn pretty quickly that, mistakes aren't failures, but a part of the process, and quite frankly, a necessary part of the process to learn and, hone your techniques. But, I think that mindset carries into my leadership style. So translate, fail fast forward, which I alluded to before. My team will tell you, I constantly say progress over perfection. I think it's important, but, the personal hobbies are also a reminder, quite honestly, to bring into the workspace, genuine love of the work and the process, not just the outcome.
That's cool. It reminds me of people that like draw with Sharpies. Like a lot of your hobbies are very like you can't really go back when you do pottery.
Can't really go back, right?
Yeah. So you're aiming to visit all 50 states before your youngest child graduates. What has been the most meaningful part of that journey so far?
Yeah, so I can't take credit for the goal. First of all, I have several friends with children who are older than mine that also really embarked on that journey, and I was so intrigued by the goal that I followed in their footsteps. But the most meaningful part, honestly, is the whole thing. I wouldn't trade the time. The experience has really been incredible. We do have an RV, so the majority of these, not all of them, but the majority of them have been traveling in an RV, which really gives us first and foremost uninterrupted family time, which is difficult to get, in those shared memories. But it's also given, me, my kids, and my husband real exposure to the diversity of the country, the cultures, the food, the landscape, the perspective. It's been grounding and eye-opening. But I think the most valuable thing for me is, seeing that through my kids' eyes, I think has been probably one of the most meaningful parts of the experience.
That's awesome. All right, we'll end off with a quick hit lightning round. So these will be sort of brief questions to go over. So, one belief about healthcare you hold that most people in the industry disagree with.
So I don't know if people would disagree. I'm going to say the patient should be at the center. Where I think I differ is I believe that patient centered care has to win even when it's inconvenient. So I think too often the patient gets sidelined when things get complicated or expensive or difficult to operationalize. And I believe if a decision doesn't improve the patient experience or outcome, it's probably the wrong one, even if it looks easy on paper.
Capability healthcare organizations consistently underinvest in.
I think you mentioned it earlier, right, in your question. I think change management and communication are two areas that are underinvested. So, as an industry, we're investing heavily in technology, but not enough helping, people understand the why so they can embrace that change. I think the best ideas fail when teams aren't brought along. And the most effective organizations really treat communication as a capability and not as an afterthought.
Talent lesson you learned the hard way.
Have hard conversations early. Avoiding them doesn't preserve relationships and actually ends up lessening trust over time. So clarity, even if it's uncomfortable, is probably one of the greatest gifts you can give a team member. And when the expectations are clear, people also have a better pathway for growth and success.
Okay, awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation today. Thanks so much for being on the show and sharing a little bit about what you guys do, how you guys think about the space, and where you guys are going. I really appreciate you having on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.